The third time I died that Tuesday, I finally learned how to keep my eyes open during transition. The trick isn't the pain. It's the way the light bends just before the heartbeat stops. Elias Thorne lived his life by the rhythm of a ticking clock, but it was a silence between the ticks that truly terrified him. For 3 months, he had not slept more than 2 hours at a time, plagued by a chronic bone-deep insomnia that was born of primal fear rather than a simple lack of exhaustion. He had become an involuntary connoisseur of the gray hour, that liminal, haunted space between the death of night and the birth of dawn, when the physical world feels thin and the boundary between the living and the spectral seems to dissolve into a shifting mist of uncertainty. Comment tag ID equals 1. In this hour, the hum of the refrigerator sounds like a morning choir, and the shadows in the corner of the eye seem to possess a weight that they lack in the light of day. / comment tag ID equals 1, text equals. This is a strong atmospheric start, but we can heighten the sensory dread by introducing an olfactory or gustatory element. For instance, in this hour, the hum of the refrigerator sounds like a morning choir. The air tastes of metallic static, and the shadows in the corner of the eye seem to possess a weight that they lack in the light of day. Type equals suggestion. He would stare at the popcorn ceiling, tracing the patterns until they began to resemble topographical maps of countries that didn't exist, waiting for the inevitable moment when the world would tilt on its axis and drop him into the abyss. The psychological toll of this vigilance was a slow erosion of his sense of self. Each night, as the clock neared midnight, his nervous system would ignite in a sympathetic flare of fight or flight, response to a threat that hadn't yet manifested. He began to dread the sunset, seeing the lengthening shadows not as a reprieve from the day, but as the encroaching borders of a prison. He tried every mundane remedy, white noise machines that only served to create more complex patterns for his auditory hallucinations, heavy blackout curtains that made the darkness inside the room feel solid and suffocating, and herbal teas that left a bitter, metallic tang on his tongue, but failed to quiet the frantic buzzing in his brain. The first episode had been a fluke, or so he desperately wanted to believe. It occurred on a sweltering Tuesday in July, a night where the heat seemed to have a physical presence, pressing against a window pane like a heavy, humid hand. The air in his apartment was stagnant, heavy with the smell of old, sun-baked books and the faint, metallic scent of a cooling radiator. He had fallen asleep on his back, a position he usually avoided due to a vague, ancestral discomfort with being so exposed, a vulnerability that felt hardwired into his DNA. The stillness of the room was absolute, yet it felt charged, as if the oxygen had been replaced by a combustible gas that only required a single spark of consciousness to ignite. He woke up abruptly at 3:14 a.m. to the sound of a window latch clicking, a sharp, metallic snap that signaled a breach of his most intimate sanctuary. His eyes snapped open, surveying his bedroom in the dim, aqueous blue light of the street lamp outside. Every instinct in his primitive lizard brain, the amygdala screaming for survival, urged him to jump up, to grab the heavy brass lamp on his nightstand, to flee into the hallway and scream for help. But his body refused the command with a chilling, absolute finality. It wasn't just a cramp or the lethargy of deep sleep. It was a total, terrifying system failure of the motor cortex. He tried to turn his head to check the window, but his neck was fused with pillow as if he were part of the bedding itself. He attempted to flex his fingers, to clench a fist, to wiggle a single toe, but his hands felt like lead weights attached to a body that no longer belonged to him. He was a passenger in a vessel that had suddenly locked its doors and cut the engine. The sensation was akin to being buried alive in a suit of cooling iron. He could feel the texture of the sheets against his skin, could feel the sweat pooling in the small of his back, but he was a ghost trapped in a meat machine that had gone offline. The harder he fought against the invisible bonds, the more the paralysis seemed to tighten, a feedback loop of physical helplessness and mental hysteria. This helplessness triggered a visceral sense of ego dissolution. Without the ability to move, his sense of where his body ended and the bed started to blur. He felt like a spill of liquid on the mattress, unable to gather himself back into a coherent shape. The silence of the room began to change, warping into something more tactile and vibrating. A low-pitched electrical hum, reminiscent of the drone of a high-voltage transformer or the buzzing of 1,000 invisible hornets, vibrated through the floorboards and up into his spine. It was a sound that didn't enter through the ears, but resonated directly within the skull, a psychic frequency that signaled the arrival of something predatory. He tried to draw a breath to shout for help, but his lungs felt as though they had been filled with industrial concrete. A crushing, suffocating pressure sat directly on his sternum. It felt exactly like a grown man standing on his chest, or perhaps a heavy, unseen beast pinning him down while peering into his soul with invisible eyes. The air became thick, tasting of copper and old dust, making every shallow gas feel like a struggle against a vacuum. Each heartbeat felt like a hammer blow against his ribs, yet his chest barely moved, a terrifying contradiction that convinced him his internal organs were failing. This is what the medical literature would later describe as apnea-induced panic. But to Elias, it was a physical sensation of a soul being squeezed out of its vessel. Then, the shadows in the corner of the room began to thicken, curdling like spilled ink in water. From the foot of the bed, a shape detached itself from the darkness. It was a tall, spindly thing, draped in what looked like tattered smoke or wet silk that trailed behind it like a funeral shroud. It moved with a terrifying, jerky fluidity, like a film skipping frames or a stop-motion monster from a forgotten era. It didn't walk. It glided in a series of disjointed teleports, appearing closer with every blink of Elias's eyes. When it reached him, it didn't attack. It simply leaned over, its presence radiating an aura of absolute, ancient malevolence, a cold so profound it made the sweat on Elias's forehead turn to ice. It leaned in until its non-face, a void where features should be, a hollow abyss of absolute nothingness, was inches from his own, and it whispered a sound that wasn't a word, but a visceral vibration that suggested he was already dead and simply hadn't realized it yet. This whisper felt like a cold needle being driven into his ear canal, echoing the sentiment that his physical existence was merely an inconvenient barrier for the entity. Just as the terror reached a crescendo that felt like it would stop his heart, the chemical paralysis snapped. Elias's hand flew up, striking the empty air where the entity had been. The room was empty. The window was locked. The only sound was a frantic, uneven thudding of his heart against his ribs, a drumbeat of pure, unadulterated panic that echoed in the hollow silence of the room. He sat there for hours, the light of his phone the only thing keeping the darkness at bay, realizing with a cold dread that his own bedroom had become a predatory landscape, and the predator lived inside his own mind. The biological betrayal and the cultural echo. In the weeks that followed, Elias became an amateur scholar of his own ruin, an obsessive cartographer of a landscape he never wished to visit. He spent his days in the university library, his eyes bloodshot and rimmed with red, scouring medical journals, neurological papers, and folklore anthologies. He needed to know if he was descending into a schizophrenic break, a neurochemical collapse, or if he was truly being targeted by something beyond the reach of modern science. He became a ghost in the stacks, flitting between the DSM-5 and dusty volumes on medieval demonology. The staff began to recognize him, the haggard man who only checked out books on the history of nightmares and the neurobiology of the brainstem. What he found was a phenomenon known to every corner of the human map, a universal terror that predates modern psychology. This was not a modern affliction of the stressed office worker, but an ancient pan-cultural haunting. In Japan, he read of the Kanashibari, the state of being bound in metal chains by an invisible, vengeful spirit, often blamed on a lack of proper ancestor worship or the crossing of an unholy threshold. In Old Norse tradition, he found the Mara, a malevolent entity that rides the chests of the sleeping to crush the breath from them, providing the etymological root for the word nightmare. The Mara was said to be the soul of a living person, detached in their sleep to torment others, a chilling thought that implied his attacker might be a reflection of someone he knew. He discovered the old hag of Newfoundland, a shriveled woman who steals the breath from the lungs, leaving her victims gasping for air in the dark. In Brazil, it was a Pisadira, a tall, gaunt woman with long fingernails who lurks on rooftops and steps on the bellies of those who sleep on their backs. He read about the Dabsag of the Hmong people, who believe these crushing demons are unappeased ancestors punishing the living, a belief so potent it was linked to sudden unexpected nocturnal death syndrome, SUNDS, in refugees during the 1970s. Even in the Mediterranean, stories of the incubus and succubus, the heavy, lustful demons that pin their victims down, spoke to a shared human experience that spanned millennia. It seemed humanity had spent thousands of years trying to name the thing that sat on Elias's chest, but the names were just masks for a deeper, more terrifying biological reality. But the disturbing truth Elias sought wasn't found in the ghosts. It was found in the wetware of the brain. He discovered the mechanics of REM, rapid eye movement, sleep, the stage where our most vivid and narratively complex dreams occur. Comment tag ID equals 2. During this stage, the brain enters a state of atonia. The brainstem, specifically a cluster of cells in the subcoeruleus nucleus, sends inhibitory signals down the spinal cord, releasing neurotransmitters like glycine and GABA to paralyze the voluntary muscles. /comment tag ID equals 2. Text equals, this section reads a bit like a textbook. To keep the reader grounded in Elias's perspective, we can weave the science into his internal monologue. For example, he learned that during REM, the brainstem, specifically a cluster of cells in the subcoeruleus nucleus, acts as a biological jailer. It floods the spinal cord with glycine and GABA, inducing atonia, a total paralysis designed to keep the dreamer from acting out their nocturnal fantasies. His jailer simply hadn't released him when the sun came up. Type equals suggestion. This is a brilliant biological safeguard, an evolutionary insurance policy designed to prevent us from physically acting out our dreams and leaping out of windows or striking our partners while we sleep. It is the body's way of tethering the physical self while the mind wanders through the impossible. Without atonia, a dream of running would result in our legs thrashing the real world, a dangerous disconnect that evolution solved by effectively severing the connection between the motor cortex and the limbs. This paralysis is so profound that even the reflexes of the diaphragm are reduced, leaving only the heart and the eyes free to move. The horror begins when the timing fails, a breakdown in the flip-flop switch of the hypothalamus. This switch is governed by the delicate balance of orexin, or hypocretin, and the neurotransmitters in the ventrolateral preoptic nucleus, VLPO. It is a glitch in the matrix of consciousness where the mind wakes up while the body is still soaked in the REM chemical bath. Because the brain is still technically in a dreaming state, it attempts to synthesize the internal dream logic with the external sensory data of the bedroom. When it finds the muscles paralyzed and the breathing shallow due to lack of intercostal muscle movement, the amygdala, the brain's fire alarm, redlines into a state of hypervigilance. It searches the room for a reason to be afraid, and when it finds nothing, it invents a reason. It projects a threat onto the visual field, pulling from the deepest, most primal archetypes of the subconscious, shadows, hags, intruders, to explain the physical sensation of being pinned down. The brain, in its desperate attempt to make sense of its own paralysis, creates a monster to justify its fear. Elias realized with shudder that he wasn't being hunted by a demon from a hellish dimension. He was being hunted by a misfiring circuit in his own head. His brain was identifying its own paralysis as an external attack. The pressure on his chest was simply the weight of his own immobile muscles and the shallow breathing of REM, interpreted by a panicked mind as a crushing weight. His own brain was the architect of the nightmare. It was a master builder that knew exactly which bricks of trauma and fear would hurt the most when they fell. This led to the hypervigilant hypothesis. When the mind is awake but the body is paralyzed, the brain enters a state of high alert, a primal survival mode. It begins to monitor the environment for any sign of danger with an intensity that borders on the supernatural. The parietal lobes, which manage our sense of self and body position, become confused by the lack of feedback from the muscles. This confusion often manifests as a sense presence, the feeling that someone else is in the room, watching, waiting. This wasn't just folklore. It was a predictable outcome of a neurological mismatch. Elias was a scientist of his own suffering, but knowing the mechanics didn't make the shadow man any less real. In fact, it made it worse. If the demon was made of his own neurons, there was nowhere to hide, no exorcism that could purge a ghost made of his own gray matter. The implications were devastating. If his own mind was the source, then the more he learned, the more sophisticated the glitch became. His research was providing the architect with more blueprints, more lore to pull from, more names to whisper in the dark. He was fueling his own haunting with the very knowledge he hoped would save him, the panopticon of the St. Jude Sleep Clinic. As the episodes transitioned from weekly to nightly, The quality of Elias's waking life began to erode into a grainy, low-contrast smear. His skin took on a sallow, translucent quality, and he suffered from auditory hallucinations even during the day. The faint sound of scratching behind walls, or his name whispered in the white noise of a running faucet. The sleep deprivation had begun to affect his micro-sleeps, tiny bursts of REM that would intrude into his waking hours, making the line between the office and the abyss dangerously porous. He felt as though he were living in a double-exposure photograph, two worlds layered over each other, neither of them fully solid. Desperate for an answer that wasn't just "you're stressed," he enrolled in a clinical study at the St. Jude Sleep Disorder Center, a brutalist concrete building that felt more like a panopticon than a hospital. The architecture itself was oppressive, sharp angles, cold surfaces, and long, echoing corridors that seemed designed to diminish the human spirit. The halls smelled of ozone and floor wax, and the air was sterile and thin, pumped through vents that rattled with metallic cough. The facility was designed to monitor the most intimate aspects of human vulnerability, stripping away the privacy of sleep for the sake of data. He was led into a small, windowless room, soundproofed and painted a neutral, soul-sucking beige. He was wired up for an overnight polysomnogram by a technician named Sarah, who spoke in hushed mechanical tones and avoided eye contact, as if Elias were already a corpse she was preparing for an autopsy. She moved with a clinical detachment that made Elias feel like a specimen rather than a patient. Sarah glued 24 gold-plated electrodes to his scalp to monitor brainwaves, EEG, focusing on the frontal, central, and occipital regions to map the electrical storms of his mind. She tucked sensors into the corners of his eyes to track the frantic movement of REM, EOG, and taped a thermistor under his nose to monitor the temperature and flow of his labored breathing. A heavy, restrictive elastic belt was cinched around his chest and abdomen to measure the rise and fall of his lungs, and a pulse oximeter clipped to his finger cast a rhythmic red glow against the wall, a digital heartbeat for the world to see. He was a marionette of wires and sensors, his every biological tremor ready to be graphed. The sheer weight of the equipment made it almost impossible to find a comfortable position, ensuring that any sleep he achieved would be shallow and prone to the very fragmentation they sought to study. Dr. Eris Thorne, no relation, a coincidence that felt like a bad omen. The lead somnologist watched behind a double-pane glass window in the observation booth, surrounded by glowing monitors that pulsed with Elias's vitals. The booth was a cockpit of data, where human experience was reduced to jagged lines and oscillating frequencies. Comment tag ID equals 3. You're experiencing a failure of the flip-flop switch. Eris's voice crackled through the intercom, sounding distant and distorted, like a transmission from a sinking ship. The hypothalamus is supposed to cleanly toggle between sleep-promoting neurons in the VLPO and wake-promoting neurons in the lateral hypothalamus. In your case, the transition is messy, a state dissociation. You are experiencing intrusion of REM into your wakefulness. We're going to catch the demon on a graph and prove it's just a phantom of the nerves. /comment tag ID equals 3. Text equals. The dialogue here is quite expository and repeats the flip-flop explanation Elias already discovered in the research section. To increase the tension, we can make Dr. Thorne sound more dismissive or clinically cold, highlighting Elias's isolation. Example: you're stuck in a transition, Elias. Eris's voice crackled through the intercom. The VLPO and the lateral hypothalamus are fighting for control, and your brain is refusing to pick a side. It's a messy state dissociation. Textbook REM intrusion. We're going to map that phantom of yours and show you exactly how harmless it is. Type equals suggestion. The doctor's confidence was a thin shield against the sheer, visceral horror of Elias's lived experience. To Eris, Elias was a fascinating case of neurochemical instability. To Elias, Eris was just another watcher in the dark, another ISET recording his descent. During the third night of the study, the temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees, a localized frost that didn't show on the facility's climate control. Elias felt a familiar, sickening crawl of electricity beneath his skin, a static charge that heralded the arrival of the architect. On the monitors in the other room, Dr. Eris saw Elias's brainwave spike into a high-frequency alpha rhythm, the unmistakable signature of a person who is wide awake and alert. Yet, the electromyogram, EMG, showed that his muscle tone remained completely flatlined in atonia. He was a stone statue with a racing, terrified mind. The heart rate monitor began to climb 110, 120, 130 beats per minute as Elias lay perfectly still. To the doctors, it was an interesting data point. To Elias, it was the sound of his soul screaming against its cage. On the infrared camera, Elias looked peaceful, almost angelic, beneath a tangle of wires that looked like mechanical vines. But inside his skull, the laboratory had undergone a grotesque transformation. Comment tag ID equals for the sterile white walls of the clinic were bleeding a thick, viscous black oil that pooled on the linoleum floor with a sound like wet meat hitting pavement. / comment tag ID equals for text equals the black oil trope is a bit common in horror. Since Elias is an architect and the story mentions the architect of nightmares, we could use something more structural and unique to his fear. For example, the sterile white walls of the clinic began to buckle, peeling back to reveal skeletal scaffolding and raw, jagged rebar that hummed with a low, unnatural vibration. Type equals suggestion. The shadow man wasn't just at the foot of the bed anymore. He was sitting in the doctor's chair in the corner, holding a clipboard made of yellowed human bone, meticulously taking notes on Elias's suffering. The entity looked up, and for the first time, Elias saw eyes, not pupils or irises, but burning, hollow embers of red light that seemed to mock the sensors attached to his head. The creature was a mirror of the clinic itself, observational, cold, and utterly indifferent to his pain. The entity rose, its elongated limbs clicking like a giant insect's mandibles, and began to unhook the electrodes from Elias's head, one by one, in the dream. In reality, Dr. Eris watched the data feeds go haywire on his screen, assuming a sensor had simply come loose due to a restless movement. The rain washed the crimson from the sidewalk, but it couldn't touch the stains on my soul. I dropped the empty casing into the gutter and walked into the dark. Justice is a high-priced meal, and tonight I was finally full.